You're listening to the Missionary Perspective Podcast with veteran missionaries Erik Johnson and Joshua Mead. We're glad you could join us. We trust this podcast will be both a blessing and a challenge as we relate topics in world evangelism from a missionary perspective. Now, here's Josh and Erik.
Welcome to the Missionary Perspective Podcast. I'm your host, Erik Johnson, and today I'm very excited to have one of my best friends in the whole world, who also happens to be an assistant pastor at my sending church. Pastor Branden Lawrence has served on the staff at Temple Baptist Church of Dulles, Virginia for about 20 years. He has served in many capacities, first as the founding pastor of Iglesia Bautista Templo in 2004, which a few years later he passed on that leadership to a native Spanish-speaking pastor. He's also served as the minister of music there for many years. He's taught in the Christian school, but most importantly for our podcast today, he's been the missions pastor at TBC for many, many years. Now, in this role as missions pastor, that's what we want to discuss with Branden today. And this role allows him to have interaction with missionaries day in and day out. Also, he does much intricate planning of men's construction trips from all over the world. He's helped lead, I believe, more than a dozen missions trips to places like Brazil, Colombia, and Cambodia, just to name a few. And he is one of the very few that have led a missions trip to both Josh Mead's ministry and our ministry here in the Dominican Republic. Branden, thanks for being on the podcast today.
Hey, man, I'm excited to be with you guys. I feel like this is something special here. I get to be on the podcast.
Well, we're reaching dozens, you know what I'm saying? So don't be too nervous here. It's just a bunch of friends having conversations. And, I've entitled this episode today, Branden, Missions in Action, the missionary in the local church. And recently on one of the channels on Facebook that we're part of, it's called the Ministry Connection channel, one of the pastors in North Carolina, a former guest, Pastor Dennis Harry, his church is getting ready to send out a missionary family for the first time. And so he's been asking a lot of people for questions about how to be a good supporting church. And so I know I come from one of the best, and I wanted to have you on today to talk about a lot of things, mostly about your life and missions, but also just an idea how local church ministries and missionaries can have a better connection. But so our listeners and our viewers can know a little bit more about you, we're going to start at the beginning. And I want you just to take time and tell us a little about who you are, the area and the family you grew up in, and how you came to know the Lord.
Yeah, so it's like you said, I serve as the missions pastor here at Temple Baptist Church. I'm assistant pastor. I do music and kids ministries and whatnot. But I grew up here in the church. So I grew up as a teenager. But my dad was a pastor. He got saved later in life. Had an amazing testimony how he got saved. But he surrendered to preach. He was 2 credits shy of a math degree at the University of Maryland. And Lord called him to preach, and he went off to Bible college at Baptist Bible College in Springfield, Missouri, back in the 70s. And that was a heyday back then. And they were sending out missionaries galore. And he finished a 4-year degree in 3, which is amazing when you think about it. If you've been through Bible college, Mom was working him through. And then he came back to the DC area. He actually went up to New England thinking maybe the Lord would have him plant something up there. It was a big push back then, plant churches up in New England, but the Lord didn't give him peace up there, and ended up coming back down to the DC area and Rockville, Maryland. He started a church, very Catholic area, great need for churches over there, and not an easy place to start a church, but he started a church there in Maryland. I was just a little kid, but he pastored there for 7 years. And so that's sort of the first memories I have of ministry, my dad being in the ministry. They were basically planning a church, and the struggles that go along with that. But I got saved at the age of 4. That's young, and I contribute that to a couple of things. For one, my parents disciplining me, helping me understand that I was a sinner, and they did that faithfully, thankfully. But in all seriousness, I mean, you understand there's consequences to your sin, your action, and your sin, and then then regularly give me the gospel. Mom was my Sunday school teacher, and regularly they shared the gospel with me, and so I remember coming to Dad on Saturday and saying, "Dad, I don't think I'm saved. I'm not going to heaven." And he asked me some questions to make sure I understood. We knelt down at the couch there, that 70s brown green couch. And I prayed and accepted the Lord as my Savior. I doubted my salvation when I was 7 or 8 or so, and I got assurance. I had friends who were like, "How do you remember when you were 4? I don't remember, 2 years ago, whatever." But I got assurance of my salvation. Then, when I was in 8th grade, I went to a Christian camp that the Christian school that I went to. We weren't yet at Temple. We were at a different church, but I went to a camp that our Christian school held. And the Lord just got a hold of my heart there in the preaching about doing whatever God wanted me to do. So I surrendered to God's will for my life. And then when I was in 10th grade, we had an evangelist named Harold Vaughn, and he was preaching on the need for revival in America.
Amen.
And I actually didn't want to be there that night. Our soccer team at our school was having a playoff game, so I had to miss that. I was a center fullback, and so I was sort of bitter about being at the service, but the Lord had been working in my heart, calling me to preach, and I was sort of resisting that. I wanted to be a professional baseball player. And so,
that's right.
Like most, like most kids, realistic dreams and
goals.
But it was real in my heart. That's what I wanted to do.
Sure.
But the Lord had something different for me, and He was working my heart. And I remember He preached on the need for revival in America, and God broke my heart. The invitation was "Have Thine Own way, Lord," and it felt like the invitation kept going. I was saved, but it was sort of like an unsaved person resisting salvation. I was resisting the call. And I remember grabbing onto the pew seat, not going. And then I thought, how can I sing "Have Thine Own way, Lord," when I haven't given my way to Him? And so went forward and surrendered to preach. And later on, then we came to the Temple. I was, like I said, in the youth group. And I remember Pastor coming and visiting us when we just started coming to church. And I mentioned to him the fact that I was called to preach, and I was looking to have somebody mentor me. And little did I know, I'd have a long mentorship program,
a long time
with Pastor Pittman, and then also my youth pastor had a big influence in my life. Well, then I went off to Bible college at Ambassador Baptist College down in Lattimore, and began training for the ministry. And I knew God had called me to preach, but I didn't know what area of ministry He wanted me to go into. And so I was talking to my youth pastor, and he said, you enjoy music. Why don't you start off majoring in music? And then when God works in your heart and you know what area of ministry you might be going, maybe it's music, maybe it's something else, but you can always use that. And so I started off majoring in music. And then I was talking with a friend of mine, he's now Pastor Nathan Dietrich, and he was majoring in evangelism at the time. And he asked me if I like to preach. And I was like, yeah, I love to preach. And he asked if I would want to preach it every day. I'm like, yeah, let me add it, And then he said, well, that's what evangelist does. He's like, why don't you major in evangelism? I'm like, sounds good to me. So I added evangelism as my second major, a double major. And really, I got to do evangelism, so to speak, in traveling for the school. I traveled 7 years for the college, both when I was in my undergrad, then I was working on my master's, and I worked for the college, traveled with groups, singing, preaching. And I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed that, but I sort of got the evangelism out of my system. But, I guess my testimony is, look, the Bible says, delight thyself also in the Lord, and He'll give you the desires of your heart. Right. And all these different things, I majored in evangelism. I look back on that and say, why did I major in evangelism? But yet I really did get to do some evangelism. And thinking about what I do now, I do some evangelism when I go on these mission trips. I'm often asked to preach and do meetings and different things. And so the Lord gives us the desires of our heart, and I've gotten to do music as well. I mean, when I started the Spanish church, we didn't have a lot of music because this church was small. And I remember later on when I transitioned back into the English church, I remember thinking, man, I haven't really got to use my music degree at all. But that's when Pastor asked me, would you be interested in leading our music ministry? Because we had lost our music pastor. But the Lord just gives us the desires of our heart. Well, I at college, I met Benita, my wife, my sophomore year, and her dad, J.B. Godfrey, was teaching missions at the college. That's a whole nother story. I had to muster up the courage to go and ask his permission to date her. But anyhow, maybe another podcast.
Yes.
But God had finally I met her my sophomore year. I think it took Lord till my senior year to convince her to date me. So
I know that.
I had some growing to do and some maturing to do, but we started dating my senior year, my second senior, not because I was failing, but because I was double majoring. We got engaged and then we got married that summer. But, as we were finishing up our time there at Ambassador, Pastor called us and we were highly considering going to the mission field. Benita grew up in the mission field. And I was open to the idea. I didn't know where. In fact, there was a time when I thought maybe God wanted me to be an evangelist on the mission field. And I don't, I didn't have a clue how that could work. But anyhow, I had a tenderness to missions. But Pastor called and said, "Hey, would you consider? I know you guys are thinking about missions, but would you consider coming back home and starting our Spanish church?" And I thought, well, that's sort of like missions,
Yeah,
I know it's back home, and I was sort of like pinching
100%.
myself, and I get to go back home. So we wanted to pray about it and make sure it was what God's will was. So we felt like it was. And so we moved back in 2004. We had just had Andrew, our oldest son, and we moved back in 2004. And I taught in the school as well. When we started our Spanish ministry, I taught Bible. And then later on, when your wife left, Holly, she was the Spanish teacher. I took over teaching Spanish in the school. But yeah, we started the Spanish mission in 2004, and you guys helped in it. And when the Lord called you guys and others helped, and Lord blessed, and it grew quickly. And 2007, it became its own church. We sort of had a decision: do we want to keep it a ministry under the English church, or have it become its own church? We thought it'd be better for them to become their own church and just meet in our building. And I became the pastor and stopped teaching in the school. And we had a choice at a certain point whether to continue pastoring that Spanish church or to hand it over to a national, so to speak, sort of like you do with missions and planting a church. And so at that time, I felt like it would flourish better having someone who spoke the language natively, was in that culture. And so, Brother Poso, Brother Marco Poso, godly brother, and he was sort of my right hand man. I asked him, I sensed the call to preach in him, and we talked about it and began training him. He was interested, and there's sort of a year transition where I was working as a music pastor along with being the Spanish pastor, and he became my assistant pastor, and he eventually took over the work. And so I came back on the English side. At first, I didn't know what I was going to do because I was sort of working my way out of a job, but that's when our music pastor left, and pastor asked me to come and work with the choir and music. And I did that. And he was enjoying me doing that and said, "Hey, I'd like you to stay and keep doing that." And I was happy to stay and keep doing that. And then our missions pastor, Larry Wright, had left. He took a pastorate, and pastor knew my heart for missions and said, "Hey, would you like to take the missions responsibility as well?" And I said, "I'd love to." And that's how I got to where I'm at. That's what I've been doing now. Since 2009. So
let's review it because you said a lot there in a few minutes there. It's pretty exciting for me when the Lord was working on my heart, and people know my testimony that when Branden came, we didn't really know each other yet. I'd have been in the church a few years, but as Branden mentioned, he had been off working with the church. Working with the school. And it was really exciting for us to finally get to know each other. And I think instantly we were best buddies. And I was still a single guy hoping for Holly's parents to say yes, but we were both serving there in the ministry. And it was very exciting because it really is like a mission field in your own backyard when you're dealing with Spanish churches or any other ethnic language. And it was so exciting because what's really unique about a Spanish church in the States is you have this mix of cultures. It's not one culture. Like when we went to the Dominican, we learned the Dominican culture, but being the pastor of a Spanish speaking church, you had from all over South America and different parts, some even in Europe, And so it was very exciting for us. It had the world's best potlucks. I know that. And we had a great time with the food there. And so that was so exciting for us to be there. In fact, you were mentioning music. I tell people this: the most scared I ever was in speaking Spanish wasn't actually speaking Spanish. Was one time when Branden was sick. And this is early on in the ministry. Okay. They asked me to lead literally maybe a simple song in Sunday school. And there probably wasn't 8 people in this Sunday school. And I don't know how long I practiced this song in Spanish. And I'm sure I didn't do very good, but that was probably the most scared. But once I learned how to do that, I felt like, well, the next step was easier and easier. So it is funny
Amen.
how our lives crossed in that. And now you also skipped over this a little bit. We're going to go back a little bit. He mentioned his wife was a missionary kid. Now, why don't you give a little bit of
Yeah.
background, mentioning, talking a little about Benita's parents and how that connection is with our podcast?
Yeah, so Bonita was born on the mission field. The Godfrey family, they were in Senegal, I think, 20 years or so, and then after that, they transitioned to the Congo because there was a great need for training. People were getting saved. There was a church of over 1,000. Dad Godfrey
Wow.
went and pastored that and helped train people there. And so she was born though in Senegal, Saint Louis, Senegal,
Mm,
where Josh Mead's
wow.
at.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting. I got to go on that mission trip there a couple of years ago. Her nanny is still there in that city, in
Wow.
that town, in the church, and I remember we were doing construction, and she came over to the construction site, and she calls me over. She was like, I'd never met her actually. She just, I mean, she heard about me, and she was like, my American son, and she's giving me a big hug, and she had me come over to their house, and
Oh
she made me a
my.
boo-boo, which is those,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
those robes that they wear, and fed me, Senegalese food. It was a cool experience. But one of these days I'd love to take Bonita back with me on a mission trip to Senegal. But they spoke Wolof and French there, the different
Mm-hmm.
languages, and that's what Bonita grew up speaking, was French. And so people often ask, how did she get the name Bonita? That's Spanish.
Right.
Well, her parents liked the name,
Yeah.
and it was easy for the Senegalese to say, and so I think, though, looking back, the Lord had everything planned out for us to be in Spanish ministry, and so it's interesting.
Uh,
My mom's name is Linda, and her
right.
mom's name is Linda. And for Spanish, Linda
Yep.
means
Yep.
pretty, bonita, beautiful. So I always joke
So
with Spanish people, I'm surrounded with beautiful and pretty women in my family.
I do remember that's a funny story, and it's very ironic at the same time. Well, that's really neat. It's neat how the Lord really from the beginning, Brandon, has had directing you, allowing you to be, grow up in a family where there was church planting, to be part of a good missions minded church, to marry a missionary kid. It just seems like it's been all surrounded in your life. And now, these many years you've been the missions pastor, we're just real briefly, a couple practical things. I was thinking about this pastor who was asking these questions recently about how to be a good sending church. And, obviously, you hope you can say with assurance, like I do, I have the best sending church, but I do feel like I have one of the best sending churches in the whole world. And it didn't happen by accident. We know it started from pastors' love for missions, even to the point where his own son went to be a missionary. But as that process kind of was taking form, he was calling in people to give advice and how to properly be a good sending church. And, we're not going to talk about numbers and things, but we're going to talk about some practical steps that maybe churches can consider to help their
Mm,
missionaries get on the field sooner, because we all
yeah.
we all agree a missionary is not called to be on deputation. Like, it's a necessary
Right.
evil. We got to do it.
Yeah.
We got to have support, and we want to have prayer partners. We want to have partners
Right.
behind us. But what can we do? What are some practical steps temples implemented over the years that have you, in your estimation, help get missionaries to the field a little quicker?
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, Pastor, like you mentioned, his son going the mission field. I think it really got him to think through,
Hmm.
and having a son go through it. What's the way that we can be more efficient with this?
Hmm.
God's called these dear folks to surrender their lives and go to the mission field. How can we make sure that happens and happens efficiently? And so, some of these ideas I'm going to share, they're not anything that I came up with. They're things that
Sure.
that I've inherited and down through the years. Brother Mims was our missions
Hmm.
pastor.
Yeah.
But I think things that really are a help. I would say this in general, we have as a church a higher level of support. And I
Hmm.
don't say this to brag, but just to get the point across, a higher level of monthly support for the missionaries that we support.
Yes.
So, so that missionaries don't spend their whole lives traveling out on deputation. Now, when I
100%.
talk to our missionaries that are out on deputation, I say, listen, think of this in a positive, you know, mindset. This is part of your ministry, and
Hmm.
you're going to influence other people toward going to the mission field. and you're going to preach and churches a lot. You're going to be a blessing. So, I think missionaries need to have that mindset that it's part of their ministry. It really is, just as much as what they're going to end up doing on the mission field. But some churches have small amounts of support because that's all they can give, and that's understandable, right? I don't want to talk down about that, but there are some large churches that I've known that have had small amounts of support, and I think we have to be careful not to, have this thing. Well, we want our church to look good. Look how many missionaries we support. Now,
right?
I want our people to be excited about how many missionaries we support, but it's not so much about that as it is, what works best for these missionaries. And so, a big church giving, a small amount so they can have a bunch of missionaries on their missions. I don't know that's as helpful.
Right. 100%.
No, I think there's a balance. I think, missionaries don't want to have a church give, a few churches give all their support, because what happens if one of those churches end up dropping the support for whatever reason down the road, or, financial
problems in the church. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a balance in this, right? But I do think that a lot of churches could do more per missionary, and that would speed the process up of missionaries get to the field, and all the missionaries out there listening to this are saying amen. But I would say this.
One thing I was going to add in, Branden, real quick before you keep going. I've noticed in the last 5 years, there are churches that may have started at a lower amount, but as missionaries have stayed on the field a little bit longer, have even ratcheted that up too. And there's almost like an inflation kind of adjustment as well, which is also another idea. I agree with you. I think generally to start off, it's better to have a bigger amount. But even that idea, if you can't start off at a bigger amount, if you say, hey, after 5 years, 10 years, you have these markers as well.
Yeah, and that might have various purposes to it. I know some churches want to make sure that the people they're supporting get to the field, because, admittedly, we've had some missionaries that the only time we supported them was on deputation, and then they either didn't end up going or they came back very quickly. You can't always know that, but so maybe that's some of why, and then some of it's just the financial position that those churches are in and how much money they have to give. But I would say another thing, Eric, we also work to take on the missionaries that we have come through.
Yeah.
And so when we agree to have a missionary come in, I really work hard to vet them ahead of time so that there's a high percentage chance that when they actually come through, they spend their gas money, their time to drive to Northern Virginia and to present in our church, that they know there's a 99% chance we're taking them on.
Right.
And I think, if churches would be more committed to taking on the missionaries they have in, doing a good job vetting them ahead of time, so they have a comfortability that they would take these missionaries on. Again, that's going to shorten the time down. Now, I tell our missionaries, you take whatever meeting you can get, because part of their support is, they'll get a love offering a lot of times in those churches, and that's helpful, right?
Right.
And so I'm not saying that if a church has a missionary and they don't end up taking them on, that they've wasted the missionary. I'm not saying that either. If they've given them a love offering, they've helped them on their way. But in terms of them getting to the mission field quicker, I do think if churches had more of a focus on vetting missionaries ahead of time, so that when they come in, there's a higher level of confidence. Yes, we're taking you guys on. That also, I think, could help, So
100%.
That's what we do for missionaries that, aren't out of our home church. I think there's things we do for our home missionaries and that a home church can do that also, can speed them along. I don't know if you wanted to talk about that, but
yeah, and I think I think of the phrase. I hadn't thought about the idea of that efficiency as well as, the people you have in really consider taking them on. That also will help deputation go much quicker for people. Those two steps are really enormous steps that I think would cut out, in some cases, maybe 6 months to a year of deputation for people if the churches are taking just a little bit extra time to say yes to a missionary before they come in, maybe to look over the recommendation letters, to look at their organization, to talk to maybe a pastor ahead of time, and to feel very confident about that. But true, I want to make that transition about helping your own home missionaries get to the field. There's a phrase that says, what gets planned gets done. And I think that's really kind of what you're going to start to say is like thinking ahead. I mean, Temple is not surprised who wants to become a missionary. and then the next week they're on deputation. There's someone gets called into missions, pastors talking to them, you're talking to them. We've probably had them go on missions trips, we know. And then there's this process that our church takes to prepare as a church for that day. How does that go for us in a simplistic way?
Yeah. It like you said, it starts with planning your budget.
Mhm.
Things I'm going to mention, didn't just happen overnight. They took some
Exactly.
time to build up. So, for instance, when you get your faith promise mission, and we believe in faith promise missions, we use faith promise
Mhm.
missions. When you get your faith, let's say I'm just throwing a number out. Let's say you get $100,000 faith promise missions promised.
Mhm.
Our philosophy is not to designate 100% of that to taking missionaries on, and for several
Mhm.
reasons. One, uh, if you've designated all that support, what happens if you don't get all that come in?
Right. Right.
Um, you know,
100%.
I, I, I don't want to be the missionary pastor that has to call Erik Johnson and say, "Sorry, you're not getting your paycheck this week." That would not be good. And then, for instance, like when we went through COVID, and,
Mhm.
and many churches had a down turn in their finances.
Sure.
Well, I'm thankful, and I don't say this to brag, but I'm thankful to the Lord that through that time, ours went down too. But
Yep.
we paid all of our missionaries all their support. The reason that happened was because we take a certain percentage of what comes in missions and put it in savings.
Sure.
That savings amount then becomes things that we can do with projects. And so these construction trips that we do, when we give 20, 30,000 toward buying land or building a building, that comes from that amount that we've saved up. Uh,
Mhm.
the fund that I'll mention here in a second that we give to our home missionaries when they go out, that's part of that. The
Mhm.
extra money that we support them at, the higher levels we support them at first, that comes from
Mhm.
that. So having that, not using all your money up. Now we believe in, if money is given to missions, it's going to go to missions, right?
Amen.
So none of this is going to
100%.
the local church.
Yeah.
That comes out of your general fund, but you have this savings amount, and it's there. And so if we fell in hard times, well, we wouldn't necessarily have to give toward a project. We could
Mhm.
use that money to keep paying our missionaries monthly. And we try to have enough savings where if all of a sudden we had this horrible thing financially happen, we could keep paying all our missionaries for 2 more years, you know,
Amen.
and
Amen.
that gives you time to let the missionaries know if it was really bad, to play in or
Yep.
whatever. But then that money, if it's not a bad time financially, can go toward these other projects and things that you can do to help
Mhm.
missionaries. So,
And
what
one
are
of the things Brandon's saying is that, this didn't happen overnight. This was something
yeah,
that,
that's
was
right.
a philosophy that was developed over the years. I just want to add before you continue. In my circumstance, Holly and I both felt called to missions. We got married and we had a plan, Brandon. I don't know if you know this. We were going to start in like August of the next year and all this different stuff. Well, the job I had, it basically had some layoffs. And I decided,
Okay.
we were actually went to a missions conference the night I got laid off, and Dr. Sis
Mm.
preached a message saying, 4 months into the harvest is waiting. And I was like, it was like 4 months to the day that when we wanted to start deputation full time. And we're like,
Wow.
the Lord's telling us to start right now. Well,
I didn't know that.
we had the ability because the
Yeah.
temple had set funds aside that
Right.
because even though I lost my job, and at that time we didn't have any kids, so obviously everyone's circumstances are different. But we could start literally the next day. Temple says, "All right, we're going to
Mm.
start at this little proactive amount for X amount
Yeah.
of months," and we
Right.
hit it hard. And in six
Yeah.
months and a year, that help allowed us to
Right.
start with so much confidence. Obviously you're stepping out on faith, but
Yeah. Yeah.
pastor used to always say, "I don't want money to be something you're always worried about." There's enough in this world
Yeah.
to worry about, and that comes
Right.
from pastor's philosophy. But that's kind of I'm trying to put it in a
Yeah.
little practical perspective for the people to understand. It really does work in that way.
Yeah. And I think it's best for missionaries when they realize it's time to start deputation that you jump in both feet.
Absolutely,
Not
100%.
like don't just sort of dab your way into it because
Yep,
um you want to be 100% prepared for that first meeting you ever have. And then
absolutely.
you want to have, meetings lined up so that every week you've got a church you're going to be in.
Yep,
Now, in order for that to happen though, there's this gap that a
yep.
missionary has to cross. And that to me is where the home church is important. And
Yeah.
so what we do, the normal support of our missionaries. So what they are normally supported at is 4 times what our support is for other missionaries.
Right.
Now that other support for other missionaries is a pretty good number, but
Absolutely.
for our home missionaries, it's 4 times that. Then when our missionaries start out on deputation, we triple that support. And so for the first 6 months of deputation, they're getting triple what
Yep.
their normal support would be. And why? Well, they got to go from full-time job. I mean, they're, although they are sacrificing to go, they got to eat, they got to have money.
Yep.
Traveling is expensive. There's extra expenses and all that. Staying in hotels that they have to if the church isn't putting them out, all this kind of stuff, and your car breaking down. And so they got to have all that support. And so we triple it the first 6 months. Then after 6 months, if they've done a good job and setting up meetings and, like I said, jumping in full time, they're going to already start to have support coming in.
Yeah.
And so then we graduate that support down to double for the next 6 months. So it's triple the first 6 months. It's double the next 6 months. They're continuing to do their deputation. And a lot of times after a year, most of our missionaries are actually had their support raised.
Amen.
And so, but if they were still on deputation, it would go to their normal support. They would finish out their deputation and, at that normal support level that we do for home missionaries. But, there's other things that we try to do. We buy them a really nice laptop. Drew Guardino, brother Drew, he's our computer guy, and he loves to talk with them and get them a really nice laptop with good hardware that they can use, and software. He'll load it up with software ahead of time. We give them a projector. We loan them a projector.
Man.
And most churches have projectors.
Yep.
I almost said slide. Doesn't that date me a little bit? Pastor order once in a while, we'll say slides, but we'll give them a projector. And that way, if a church's projector's not working, or if you're in a smaller church and they don't have a projector, they can hook their laptop up, their projector, and still show their presentation. So we try to provide them with the stuff that they need. And then we have a substantially large setup fund. And again, that comes from that savings, and we're projecting, like we know we've got a single young lady who's going to be starting soon. We got another one that's looking at doing that. So we're sort of planning ahead of time down the road for that and putting back money for that. And so we have this startup fund, and this startup fund, what is it for? Well, they need to get prayer cards, right? So paying for their prayer cards to get printed, get an ample supply of that. They've got to get a display done, something they can put on their table, buy things for the table. They've got to get a video presentation prepared. And then, there's other costs in that setup fund works for that. I have a shared Excel file, and every time they spend money, they'll put it on that. I'll send them a check, and it was sort of a particular file. They keep the receipts. But then, when it comes time for them to move to the mission field and to buy some of the furniture or whatever they need once they get on the field, or maybe a vehicle, the shipping costs can a lot of times be expensive, especially if it's a family.
Absolutely.
And they have, and they have to use wisdom, whether it's better to buy stuff over there or, here you've got customs costs, and sometimes it's better just to buy it over there. But we have that startup fund that lets them get a good start, on the mission field. A lot of missionaries, I forget what the statistics are, but there's a lot of missionaries that quit within the first 1 or 2 terms. Absolutely. And I think it's cultural shock, but I think it's also sometimes because they go either not supported enough, or they get there and there's all these extra expenses that they're struggling with, and they just get discouraged. All of us have had times in our finances where we've gotten tight and can be really discouraging. Here you are in a foreign field, and I mean, it's just all that is multiplied, right? And so we want them to get there and have a good start, and a good foundation to build on. And so those are some of the things that we try to do. I think also just encouraging them to get those meetings, to be in churches. We tell them we love you, and if you're home, don't feel guilty about it. We'll enjoy the fellowship. But I would, even if I didn't have a meeting, I'd just go find a church and I'd drop in. Because I know as a missions pastor, when I get missionaries that come and drop in, it's not necessarily I'm going to give them support. Although I've had some of our missionaries get support just dropping in. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Did you ever have that happen?
Yes.
Did you ever have
happened last time I saw you that Sunday morning the Sunday morning.
Okay.
So
it's the missionaries that are out there. I'd say be in churches, just even if you don't have a meeting. No pastor's going to mind you dropping in. Now be ready. They might have you preach.
That's right. Always be ready.
Present. So be ready. But yeah, those are the things that I think help missionaries get to the field quickly. And of course, it's the Lord opening doors as well. So praying that God opens doors for them, praying for their safety, and just encouraging them, not to give up and just to keep on going. So, yeah.
Amen. Well, we're winding down to the end of this, and so I just want to put a little bow on this, and we might be able to have a second podcast here in a minute, but just real briefly, synopsis here. What Pastor Brandon's talking about was something that's been forged over 20 years of planning, and it doesn't happen overnight. But when you have some of those principles, you have some of those ideas, every church can't do it at the same extent, but everyone can plan ahead of time. And so this is going to be part A. Hopefully we'll have a part B with our dear friend, Pastor Branden Lawrence.